Is that the toll booth right there?
Yes.
On the picture?
Yeah, there's a little white roof, or light-colored roof barn, and then the toll booth. There were 11 toll stops on the 308 or 309 miles of the Ohio and Erie Canal. And one of the two, and to put, I guess, back up a little bit, to put this in perspective, the city was platted in 1806, 1807 by Christian Deerdorf and Jesse Slinger. And they basically extended from Cherry Street to the alley to the east of Race Street and north to the alley that runs parallel to 4th Street. And it was comprised 256 lots. And are you folks familiar with this early history, or do you want me to go into that a little bit? Okay. So what happened was Christian Deerdorf and Jesse Slingler were brothers-in-law, young men, early 20s, and they were industrious. They were originally from I forget what county in Pennsylvania, but they wound up in Maryland. They partnered with a fellow by the name of Christian Bone, who never came to this area, but they came up into Ohio in 1804, 1805, looking for property to plat and develop and promote. And I mean, it was a business venture. And they settled upon this area because they had a really nice plateau. You had the river, which is, of course, important to anything that's going to happen from that point on. And then set about laying out the 256 lots I mentioned. And all the old city lots are all the same. They're like 49.5 feet wide and 150 feet deep. And even, for the most part, in the older parts of town, they continued with that, which that's a pretty typical size. But the way I like to put it, for a long time, Dover was more of an idea than a reality. And there are an awful lot of towns that either never took off or maybe flourished for a little while, started to grow, and then went away. So what cemented the history of Dover more than anything was the coming of canals. You tend to see canals along rivers, and I never paid that much attention. I figured, well, it's the same level, and it's not. A canal always has to be higher than the river, otherwise every time the river comes up, it would wash out the canal. Well, because of that, they have to have a continued source of water for each section of the canal. And in this case, the source of water was the sugar creek. And water was diverted about 3.5 miles north of town, up behind Mintech, which is the old Zedmark in that vicinity, and ran along the ridge that runs right along northern from this end of town. There's a terminal moraine, and it then entered the canal down here, and it provided water for the Dover section. And the Dover section is from down in the bottoms going out 800. There's a red shingled house that's been there. It was originally the lock tenant's house. There was a lock there, and then all the way over into Lockport. That was the Dover section of the canal. So in order for that to be true, not only do you have to construct a means to get water through it, water continuously flows in and continuously flows out. So there was an overflow here beyond, in the vicinity of the wastewater plant built. And that's where then Christian Deerdorf built his mill. He had a continued source of water pipe, because you have water always pouring in, always pouring out. Now, having said that, a couple of things go along with that. Because there was a mill here, there was already somewhat of a trade in. Thank you. Then with the canal coming along and a much larger mill, then that really opened up the area as a center for milling. And that was the first. The reason J. Reeves and his brother came to Dover was the Dover rolling mill was failing. They were brought into town to help turn that business around, which they did very successfully. So really and truly, the American Sheet Tin was the first, then later Reeves mill. It was so successful that J. Reeves went to the First National Exchange Bank, which we'll take a look at here later, which would have been on 3rd Street, took out a loan, bought the property, and then that became the first Reeves mill. What most people think of as the Reeves mill was actually around the time of the turn of the century. J. Reeves was becoming less active, going into semi-retirement. His son, Sam, was taking things on, and in fact, he was very highly regarded. Apparently, he had a good time with the business, and he was known. His nickname was the Young Carnegie. So he was very successful, and he started to build up what we pretty much think of as the Reeves mill. And at any rate, That then became American Sheet and Tin. And there were 2 American Sheet and Tin plants in this area. One of them here and one of them were Great Almonds. Back to the boarding house. American Sheet and Tin funded a reading room, public reading room. They subscribed to current periodicals, bought a supply of books, and it was open to the public as well as employees. It started off as an employee type thing. And that was the first semblance of a public library in Dover. It wasn't the Dover Public Library, but that was the first recorded known example of being a library. From here, then, Christian Deerdorf had a house near his mill on the Sugar Creek. He actually built on lot 2 or 3, which was down near Walnut here. And he was the first postmaster in Dover. The post office was in his home. And for a brief time, he was on the Ohio legislature. He was a judge. He was a very successful guy in his lifetime, and most closely associated with Dover. And looking again at the first picture, on the other side of Tuscarawas Avenue, where the sidewalk ends and then resumes, you see the railroad terminal, which was a passenger terminal. And it was shared by the railroad and the interurban, or the trolley cars. So that was where that was a passenger terminal. Of course, being trolley cars, they would stop along the way as well, but that would have been a destination point. Right where this building is, which was Weaver Motors, you can see that you can't make it out, but it says on the top on this picture, American House. That was a hotel. Further down, and it's off to the right in this field of view, of course, all of you, I'm sure, remember the old Riverside, which was torn down just a few years ago. And the Riverside, that started off as an 8-room building, and it was added on to, and it pretty much reached the final form and size everybody's familiar with about the same time, about 1906. And that's, I believe, what became known as the Riverside as well. In the distance, you can, in the very center, at the very top of the top photograph, you can see the spire from St. Joe's Church, which is on the same location as the current church. And off to, that's enough about the church. The second picture shows the construction of the cement bridge in 1906. And a little bit of background, in dealing with a river, you have to deal with bridges. And if you have bridges in the early days, it was not uncommon to have damaged sections or bridges wiped out. The first bridge to cross the river was built by Christian Deerdorf. And it was a wooden covered bridge, which this sounds outrageous when you say it, was 435 feet long. Most of it was over land. And in the maps of somewhat later days, you can see, and it took off diagonally from somewhere more or less across from where that alley is and over toward West Iron Avenue, which I suspect was probably a county road. But in looking at maps of the day, there were a couple of prominences, and actually where it actually crossed the water was the narrowest point. And it was a toll bridge, and it was in place for 15 or 20 years. They wound up being wiped out by a flood or an ice jam, and there were subsequent bridges in Worcester and Tuscarawas Avenue. And I believe the Tuscarawas, it was damaged and not usable for a period. There was no bridge here for a while. After an iron bridge was damaged, and I think it was due to an ice flow, a section was damaged. That's what they replaced with the cement bridge. Now, and of course the cement bridge stood for over 100 years. And it was quite a focal point of pride in the community. You see a lot of postcards that have a picture of the cement bridge. At the time it was built, it was the most expensive public project in the town. At the top of the next picture, where you see the Sugar Creek Falls. What this actually is, this is what's called a slackwater dam across the Sugar Creek. And in order to divert water to the canal, I'm sure the Sugar Creek is very much like it is today, rather shallow and narrow. And by putting a slackwater dam that the water cascades over the top, they can make it wider and deeper. That enabled them to back up water, divert water for this section of the canal. But it also made a crossing point, because you have to be able to cross the canal boats, and it would have been deep enough and placid enough. And you see the walkway was actually an extension of the towpath. The bottom picture actually shows that boarding house I told you about, where the reading room was. And also you see in front of here, along Front Street, trolley cars. And trolley tracks that came up Tuscarawas Avenue. You had trolley tracks extend across here. You had trolley tracks extend across 3rd. They continued up Tuscarawas Avenue to 7th Street, went down 7th Street, and went almost to the end of 7th Street and diverted up toward where they had a maintenance mark. So that was just a spur. That was the only reason that was there, was so they could take cars there for maintenance. And it was also where there was a powerhouse. There was a dynamo that powered this section, the Dover section of the trolley. And the way the trolley system worked, and this particular system started in Uhrichsville, came through New Philadelphia, Dover, Strasburg, and on. You could go on up into Cleveland. It operated from 1906 to 29. And the powerhouse that was there, they also provided power and sold power to the city for traffic lights. And the city had, I believe, 85 street lights. At some point, the city felt they were being gouged because they kept raising the rates. And that was the impetus that led toward the city eventually to build the light plant. And that went online in 1910. There was a lengthy legal battle, and that they tried to stop that. Then there was a public debate in the paper that it got pretty heated. And I think all they successfully did is they convinced everybody. By the time a bond issue went on, it passed overwhelmingly. I think all the ads that, and I can't recall whether it was Edison, I think it was the Edison company, put in the paper, every day was a different reason why you didn't need a light lamp. And I think anybody that was undecided, it pretty much had them convinced that that was the thing to do. So at any rate, back to the diversion of water for the canal. That then became an important part of our community for a couple of different reasons. That was called the Calico Ditch. And like I said, it ran about 3.5 miles along the ridge on the west side of town. And the reason it's called the Calico Ditch is the people that worked there were paid partly in money and partly in goods, and part of the goods they were paid with was cloth, calico cloth. When the Calico Ditch first opened and they tried to divert water, the water did not get to Dover. It's all sandy soil, and it literally soaked into the ground before it got here. So they dammed it back up, and then they lined it with clay, and they herded pigs down through the ditch itself. And the shape of the, and apparently it was a common thing, the shape of their hooves packed the clay into the soil, they opened it back up, and okay, voila, now we got this section of canal. The bottom picture, just one other thing I wanted, two things I guess. At the very far left, you see a white 3 or 4 story building. That was the Cascade Mill that Christian Deerdorf built at the overflow. Now, the other thing that you see here, this 4-story building on the other end was at various times a printer and lithographer shop, a furniture factory, and so forth. To the left of that, you can't quite see it, on the other side of the canal was a warehouse, a 4-story furniture warehouse. And after the waters receded from the 1913 flood, that collapsed. And that was probably the most noteworthy thing in Dover. I mean, Tin Town was badly flooded about to the level where the light plant is. But it was noted far and wide that when that collapsed, that the resounding crash could be heard throughout the entire town. It was, as designed, it was 40 feet wide, 3 or 4 feet. Now the lower photograph shows an excursion boat, and there were several. It was a popular thing. Folks would take excursion boats and go up to, it's called Yankee Dan's Island, which if you're going out of town on 800, you look off to the right, it's kind of a long island in the middle of the river. It was a popular picnic spot. Those people would go for family reunions. For a period of a few years, the zoo was just a really popular spot. On the other side of the railroad was the Riley Tar Plant, which was in operation for a very long time. And unfortunately, there's some cleanup issues related with that, which some of you may remember from 20-25 years ago, and that's kind of an ongoing thing as far as environmental cleanup. There were 2 major fires at Riley Tar in the 1920s, both of which, in one case they called fire engines from Massillon and Canton, and the other they called down an engine company from the city of Canton. That was the last one in 1926. Going on here, behind the buildings on Tuscarawas Avenue, you had that blast furnace I mentioned, continued to grow. It changed ownership 4 or 5 times, and it existed from 1851 till 1929. When it closed, it was the Penn blast furnace. Prior to that, and for a period of time, it was the Hanna blast furnace. Mark Hanna, who owned it at that time, is the Mark Hanna who was a Cleveland industrialist and steel man, who is the guy that promoted and pushed and funded the campaign of William McKinley. They put him in the White House. Far south is on the opposite side of this building. One of the few remnants of two is a brick building on the other side behind the old Bueller's. And then over on the opposite side where you have the storage, rental storage units, there's a small white painted brick building back in there. And if you can visualize it, those are pretty much at the extreme north and south ends of the plant. So everything in between eventually was blast furnace. So what that means is for a period of close to 20 years, when they expanded, they got permission from the city to divert what was then called the Ragersville Road. It was 3rd Street until you crossed Factory Street, Tuscarawas Avenue. And they kind of lagged on that. They didn't really create a diversion for about 3 years. Well, there's a lady that owned a boarding house on the other side that came to city council and said, "Come on! I don't have any business because there's no road going past my house anymore." So they put a gravel road around the northern side of the blast furnace. A little bit of background about this type of thing. It was very common in the Midwest to have this type of furnace. And initially they were all fired with charcoal and later with coal. And anyhow, as a result of that, from about the 1870s until after the turn of the century, the majority of Ohio was deforested. And it took many, many, many years for this to come back. In fact, if you see pictures taken in Dover into the late 1940s and you see the ridges around town, if you have a decent picture, you can see there aren't many trees on it. And there weren't houses there then, they weren't farmers' fields. So they would clear cut huge areas and they would mound up earth around trees and basically create a way of creating a large quantity of charcoal. And it really, really messed up the environment for a very long time in our state and throughout the Midwest. And it opened in 1907. It had a pretty good sized ballroom in it. The guy that was the manager was a fellow by the name of Daniel Deardorff, who was the mayor during the hardest part of the debate and the fight to build the light plant. If you look very closely, well, you may not be able to read it on here, that little square sign on the power pole out front says NOT&L ticket office or something to that effect. So if you were going to go any great length on the NOT&L, that's where you go pick up the ticket. The bottom picture is the hardest, what was originally the Hardesty Mill. And in the late 1850s, the Hardesty family came to town in Carroll County. They had a milling concern there. They then built this mill, which would have been off in that area. Behind the buildings that line Tuscarawas Avenue and sort of behind the TV Specialties. And this is a pretty late picture, and this is what was left of that. So originally that was also powered by the Calico Ditch. The Calico Ditch extended down from Broad Street down through here, and there was a turning basin in this area where boats would stage and you could also turn them around. Went right through the blast furnace. In pictures you may see there was an extended trestle. There were 2 or 3 of the rail lines that went up into the plant, and there were trestles built over top of the Calico Ditch. And actually at the top of the next page you see a railroad bridge across the ditch, and this is part of the operation of the blast furnace. Back in my office I have copies of the original documents, and the only thing wrong, and that's partly why many of the buildings were torn down. In talking with the guys I started with, and when you'd see a photograph, the buildings looked fine in the front. So most of them were pretty bad. If you went around the back of the building, it was pretty rough. But what urban renewal was, which was actually a school of thought, and I believe there's federal funding involved, was where you come into communities, get rid of decrepit structures, come up with a master plan as to what you should do in that. And the only thing wrong with urban renewal in this city is it was never finished. All they did was the first step. There was a popular vote at one point. I gather it wasn't really campaigned for very well, and it was shot down. Among the documents that I have, it shows there being a riverfront park, modern buildings built, parking in logical places and that kind of thing. So there really was a very good plan that was developed. One thing I neglected to mention, when we were at the site of the Dover Hotel, there's a photograph, and I couldn't find it, that was taken in 1872. There had been an inn, a tavern and inn there, a small wood two-story frame building. Actually very similar in form to where Roslyn's Music is, which is a very, very old building, which had been a tavern. That was the location of the first temperance raid in Tuscarawas County in 1872. And there's a picture taken when that was going on. There's kind of a mob out in the street. There were two buildings on this location, one of which was the Central Hotel. So if you think about it, in a very small area you had the Riverside, the American House, the Herbert House, and the Central Hotel. So there was a lot of activity. Now, I don't think any of them, probably the fanciest among them was the Herbert House, I would suspect. I've not seen any pictures inside the Central Hotel. Dover was a town, a blue-collar town. I mean, it had mills, it had a lot of that kind of thing going. I've got to think that most of the clientele probably were people that, for whatever reason, were in town because of that, because of the business that was here, and certainly some travelers. Like I said, I would suspect the Herbert House or the Dover Hotel was the fanciest. The Central Hotel was built by a fellow by the name of Horn, and originally he had some commercial buildings behind where Chase Bank is. There were some wood frame buildings, a restaurant, a small hotel, and so on. Just 3 or 4 different businesses in a row. And I believe in the 1890s, late 1880s, he built the Central Hotel. That was in the 1890s. And in fact, when it was built, there was a telephone in every room, and I think that they had plumbing fixtures in every room or associated with every room, which was a selling point. That was a big deal. And including back to the Factory Street Bridge and the fact that for several years it wasn't used. That was a big deal. A lot of people walked to work, and of course you had, on the other side of the river to the right, you had the Sad Iron plant, which was Dover Manufacturing, which most of that plant still exists, those buildings. And of course you had American Sheet Tin, Greer Steel, Reeve Steel. There were a lot of working class guys, and they would walk to and from work. A fella, when that bridge was damaged, a fellow who worked for the state auditor's office by the name of Vic Donahue, who was from New Philadelphia, who I don't recall whether it was, I'm pretty sure he still worked for the state auditor's office. He may have been a congressman, I don't recall. After a couple of years, he petitioned the railroad to allow them to build a cantilever walkway off the side, because we're inconveniencing an awful lot of people until we get a bridge. And there are pictures that exist that show that. Now, on this span of Factory Street at one time in, I believe, 1914, there was something like 14 bars. It was a mill town. And that's not only where you would go to have some beers, but that's where you pick up your meals. And in fact, I know from talking to some folks here that say, oh, I remember my dad or my grandpa or whatever, they would prepare meals that they'd pick up on the way, sandwiches or whatever, some guys, put them in their lunchbox, and head to work. Now this particular bottom picture, this J.D. Bott's Cafe, sat more or less where that blue car is. I stumbled across at the library an article in in the newspaper. I was looking through some microfilm for something else that date this as being about 1906 to 1908, because later on I came across, there was a little paragraph that said that this guy was opening his cafe, and sometime later, I made a mental note of it, it was around 1908, there's a little paragraph that said this cafe was closing. So that's a pretty good range of when this photograph was taken. Also, all the streets downtown were dirt until 1906 when they started to pave the streets with brick. So any photograph you see with a dirt street is prior to 1906. And that was a pretty big deal. That was a big public works project. You see on the left of the picture, the cigar store Indian. There was Rest Brothers Cigar Store. On the corner here you had Joe Freeze. There was a rather deep building, went all the way back to the alley. Back to this building. And then adjacent to that was this little skinny brick building. And that was Rest Brothers Cigar Store for a very long time. Now the gentleman at the bottom of the page is crossing Factory Street. Right about there. Again, this is actually prior to 1900, but we know it's prior to 1906 because it's a dirt street. The buildings that you see on the left, the brick buildings, are both right there. The buildings further down are still there. The building, the two-story building you see on the corner of the alley, is that one-story building right there. This building was all built in 1870. The top picture shows the first storm sewer, major storm sewer, going on the the west side of town. Doesn't seem too historically significant, but what they did is, after the 1913 flood that wiped out the canal, that storm sewer was put in the Calico Ditch. The Calico Ditch came right where you see that Springleaf Financial, that's Broad Street, and the reason Broad Street is so wide is the Calico Ditch ran right down the middle of it. So as a matter of practicality, that's where they buried the storm sewer. That's still the major storm sewer for this. Everything runs into that and then into the river. This picture on the bottom is the Dyson Furtick building, right across the street. When it was built in 1871, at a cost of $40,000, this was the largest and most expensive commercial building in Dover. This picture was taken in July of 1886, and what the firemen are doing is they had rebuilt the steamer that they had at that time, and they're testing it out of one of the fire cisterns. A number of years ago, some of you remember the gas company replaced the gas lines down 3rd Street, cut the pavement, hit one side, come over and hit the other side. Well, they ran into a little obstacle right about here. As you can see, they had to cut out, come around, and go down. That's because between here and there is one of the fire cisterns. And that was kind of a surprise to them, and that's why the pavement is cut the way it is. The fire cisterns were put in 1874. The village paid a guy $410 a piece to put in, and what it is a sandstone vault. It's 22 feet long and 12 feet wide and holds, I forget how many barrels of water. And how they were fed is off of the gutters and downspouts off of the building. They were lined with clay on the bottom, and in 1998, when we had our 125th anniversary, and they were all pumped dry. In fact, this was dry when they uncovered it. And opened up a little hole where one of the manholes was. But in 1998, we filled the one on the square with water, and we had a fella that owns our 1925 pumper fire engine come down and pump water out of that. And if you go down and open up one of the lids, right, it's still not empty. So, at any rate, that's what the bottom picture depicts. Now, the top picture is a lithograph off the back of a printed photo that was mounted on cardboard. You've probably all seen these if you have old family pictures, you've been to a flea market, there's thousands of Strickmaker photographs around here. That is that building. It's the blonde brick-colored building. With the twilight. Yeah. It was refaced in the 1920s or 30s, but those originally were built in the 1870s or 80s, probably 1880s, and they were both two similar brick buildings. if you look at that lithograph, and you can't really see it here very clearly, but the main door on the left, it says something's Central Drugstore, but above the door it says Post Office. On the right is the Exchange Bank, and the vault is still in that building. The Exchange Bank is where J.E. Reeves went to secure a loan to start himself in business as an industrialist in Dover. The building on the left where it says Post Office, over the years I've seen 4 different locations where there were post offices on old insurance maps. And I really think the odds are, and then the last one was a wood frame building where the current post office is. And if you go to the Reeves Museum, the Reeves family had acquired the old counter and post office boxes. And I rather suspect, but can't prove, that probably the Postal Service leased spaces and did not have a building until they built the current post office. And that was built in 1933. What I found out about 15 years ago is that's a standard design post office. For a certain size town, they had a set number of floor plans. And I went up to Bedford. I was in an architect's office that's in their old post office. And if you look at this building, it's been added on to on the left. It was made larger. But I said, geez, this is the same as ours. He said, well, they all are. It was a standard deal, and they come to the city fathers, and what you could choose for your community was the trim. In that case, it was a brick building. It had stone trim, but you could choose the color of the brick, the ornamentation, and that kind of thing. It's a standard design post office of that era. The bottom picture shows the grand opening of Feinberg Store, which is on the right. That was in 1922. For years, I thought this was a more modern building where the senior center was, where the sweeper place is now. That building, and one night I was just out for a walk and I walked down the alley, and it was very apparent that it was a much older building because you could see window openings and door openings. In the 1950s, I would suspect, I don't know whether there were structural issues, but I would suspect more than anything because they didn't really use the upstairs, and to make it look like a more modern building when it was Schwartz's, wasn't it? And Klein's was across, this was Schwartz's.
Yeah, Klein's over there at Schwartz, yeah.
Which was
women's clothes.
Women's clothes.
Yeah.
And
my mom wanted a very new Chevy there.
No kidding.
Yeah.
Wow. Wow.
Right there, yeah.
Across the street where Crocker's is for a period of about 70 years was, oh geez.
You remember when we was in there?
Sennhauser's.
Yeah, Sennhauser's clothing. Yeah.
And they had stores, I think, in Philly, Youngstown, and maybe Wheeling. They had several stores, but they were on that location for about 70 years. The top of the next page is taken from the center of Tuscarawas Avenue looking south. And you can see the building on the right, and actually, well, you can't read Sennhauser's there, but that's what was there then. This was Joe Freed's, and you had that whole commercial strip down both sides. Now, the Dice, this is the Dice Memorial Building, which was built as the YMCA in 1927. And that was a huge big deal if you think about it in terms of the community. To put that in perspective, the new Y was built in 1974. And if you look at the time frame, this had fallen into disuse and was replaced. We're not too many years away if you think about it. Now, among the things, sometimes progress isn't really progress, it's just change. And I'm not knocking the Y by saying this because it's true everywhere. Everybody you talk to who's born and raised in Dover, who is 50, 55 or older, who has memories of this building, what changed was not only the location of the Y, but the nature of the Y. Everybody you talk to says, oh my God, I have $2 in my pocket, I go down in the morning, I play ping pong, I go swimming, I go to dance at night. It no longer is the same type of, it's a health club, and that's fine, but that affects the character of the community too. And there was really nothing to fill that gap when this moved out of the downtown. So, and unfortunately, and we're very fortunate we've got a good park system, the city does have Memorial Hall, but those are the, I guess, in my opinion, and it's not that anybody did anything wrong, those are the kind of things that people who are involved on the governmental side of things and in the community need to keep in mind is literally the big picture. That was a big deal. That was a big loss, and nobody even realized it until after it happened. It doesn't sink in until it's not there. Colby and Company, which is the bar in the center on this side, was on fire. There were people hanging off the balcony. When they get there, take a ground ladder off the ladder truck, get them down. Philly's just pulling up. They just got them out. Took a hose line up the ladder to put the fire out. And from the pictures that one of our cops had taken at that time, was very evident it was already in the building on each side, in the upstairs of the building. And by the time they managed to get those people down and get a hose line up there, they got literally pushed right back out. So then they tried to go from up the stairs. There was the entry door to the bar, and then there's a door here and a stairwell going up to the second floor. Literally, to just make it to the floor level, and driven back down. And that building, the building of origin was 165 feet deep. It connected the two buildings around the corner. So fairly early on, and what happened is, and you know, you hear all different kind of things. You hear people complain about building codes and this and that and blah, blah, blah. Building codes and plumbing codes and electrical codes are public safety. That's the only reason they exist. And nobody intended to build unsafe buildings. Nobody, when they made changes to these buildings, intended to do anything unsafe. But the reality is, it's like Jamie Snyder was the fire chief in Philly, and that morning, later in the morning, I walked up to him and said, you know, this fire problem started about 1870. It was just made successively worse by the way people changed the building. And the only thing missing up until now is the fire. And what I mean by that is, when those buildings were built, in some cases you had abutting joist ends through party walls. And you had, of course, all the original ceilings were like 12-foot ceilings. Many of them were tin ceilings. And say in the 1930s or 40s, they dropped the ceiling a foot or two. And it gets to be the 1970s, and it's a lot more costly to heat buildings. So you got all kinds of void spaces, and there was just no way to get ahead of it. But yeah, that was, and that area-wise, there have been larger dollar loss fires, but area-wise, that's been much more extensive fires. Now, one thing I neglected to mention is where TV Specialties is, there are actually two buildings. The building on the left, when somebody mentioned the Opera House, was built as the Big Four Opera House. And if you're sitting at this light going that way, if you look, as you go down through that light and look at the side of that building along the alley, you can see the roof level goes like this at the rear, in that direction. That's the stage end. If you go into the building, and I have no idea what you call it, but all the racks with the pulleys and where they hoist props and scenery and that still exist up there. And there are no good photographs of that building. And there's one that shows it in the background. It was taken down, and it's very, very hard to see. About probably 20 years ago or so, there was a small 1830s, 1840s vintage, nice wood frame house that sat on this lot that Jeff Miller, who has a local cabinet shop, local businessman, had moved. I've always heard it was reputed to have been a Quantrell home. I don't know that it had ever been substantiated. I do know there was a house that's been significantly remodeled that was the home that William Quantrell's mother lived in up on 8th Street, on West 8th Street. And that does date back, you wouldn't think looking at it, you would guess it was made in the 1930s or 40s. It's much, much older. So, now, back to the Ferdigs, and a little bit more about local history. This particular home, we get a bunch of traffic. This was the George Ferdig home, and he was the guy that owned, at least partly owned the wholesale grocery business. This property was called the Oaks because apparently it had a couple of the big oak trees on the property. What this property is more famous for is for who was born and raised here. George Ferdig was the maternal grandfather of Elliot Nugent. If you look at the historic markers, Elliot Nugent's one of the names on the marker. Elliot Nugent was a very bright, very athletic guy, and his grandfather, his paternal grandfather and parents were vaudevillians. He had appeared on the stage at least a few times as young as 3 or 4 years old, and he would occasionally go with his parents. His grandfather was J.C. Nugent, and he was quite a character. In fact, there was a reminiscence. I talked to one of Elliot Nugent's daughters. Both of them lived in this kind of an artistic enclave community in Mexico. And I talked to her, and she said, "I'll never forget my grandpa. He's a real character." He said, "When I was wee little," said he'd get one of us on his lap, and it was a great storytelling. He'd start off a story, and he'd always start off the same. "Now, when I was a little girl," and he said he was just quite a character. Well, Elliot Nugent was a good student, a good athlete. He was the captain of the football team of the class of 1915. And, no, that's okay. And he was also the first valedictorian to graduate from Roosevelt High School. Roosevelt High School is the 5th Street wing of the school. And that was a big deal when it was built. Elliot Nugent went to Ohio State University. Are any of you familiar, or many of you familiar with this story much at all? He went to Ohio State University, which was not the biggest campus in the world at that time. It was primarily an agricultural school. He befriended a Columbus native who was also going to school there by the name of James Thurber, and they remained close friends their entire lives. James Thurber, I'm sure you're all familiar with him, had very poor eyesight, and it went back to a childhood sledding accident, I want to say. I'm not sure. But he had very poor eyesight as a result of an injury. As a result, and I think he tended to be kind of introspective anyway, but he was really withdrawn. And Elliot Nugent kind of brought him out of his shell. Of course, James Thurber, probably behind Mark Twain, is the second greatest American humorist, arguably, up to today. In the 1940s, they collaborated. Well, I kind of got off track a little bit. Elliot Nugent then went to Hollywood. Well, first of all, he went to New York, was a stage star, began to write, moved to Hollywood, wrote, directed, produced, and acted in movies, ranging from the 1920s up into the last movies he was involved with, I think, was in the late 1950s. He was a very successful guy, and very successful on many levels. In the 1940s, he and James Thurber collaborated on 2 plays that were among the most popular plays of the 1940s, The Male Animal and The Voice of the Turtle. So, I don't remember the dates exactly, but I do know, again, looking through notes, reference was made to around that time, from 1906, 1907, there being a public fund drive and subscription thing to establish a public library. And then American Sheet and Tin donated what they had at the boarding house toward the funding of the library.
So was this building considered like?
No, this house was in front of this lot. And then they moved across the street just to build that. And I don't know if it was a thing that was exclusively available to American Legion, or maybe they established a pecking order of the type of organizations that could apply. But that was what was used to fund the original building in 1919. Then it was added on to in the 30s, and then a little bit subsequently. And Julius Ricksecker, yeah, it does. And Julius Ricksecker was a jeweler, and then this was continuously owned by members of his family up until 4 or 5 years ago. The Schuffs, they're Dave and Jane Schuff. Jane was a Ricksecker. There's only, to my knowledge, one other home that for a very long time has been in the same family or close to it, and that'd be the Hardesty home, which is on the corner of 6th Street on the right. If you leave the library, then there's a blue and white P-man on the left, and there's a yellow brick, similar era Italian 8 on the right, and that was the Hardesty home, and it still is. The gentleman that lived there was a direct descendant, and his niece bought it, so there's still a family connection. So that may be the only, if you look at the long term, the longest where the same families lived in the same home.
What's the oldest building in town?
I've heard, and I don't know for a fact, but I know it's quite a bit older than you would assume. Roslyn's Music is, I believe, the oldest commercial building, the oldest home. It's hard to say because there are log homes. And I would suspect it would almost have to be a house on Front Street. Somewhere on Front Street.
Where it started, huh?